Hey, I'm Mr. Terry, a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, over the past couple weeks, I have been trying to put out content to help you guys understand the historical context of the Russia and Ukraine situation that is so big on world news right now. And with how popular those videos have been, it's definitely shown me that you guys want to see more of this, and I will oblige. I've said this in the previous videos, but it is so important to understand current events through the scope of history. It explains a lot of things, and it helps you make more informed decisions when trying to make evaluations about these things. Now, there's a lot of content being pumped out right now on the internet. And of course, a lot of it's going to be good and a lot of it's not going to be so good. So I was brought to the attention, though, of a video that I've now seen multiple people say it might be the best one on explaining the context leading up to the conflict right now. And it's actually from a channel that I have covered a few times, and that is Real Life Lore. So they did a video and it's simply called Why Russia is Invading Ukraine. And I've heard that it has historical context leading up to it, and that's so important. Don't just want to hear about what's happening now for my perspective and for what I do on my channel. I want to expose people to the historical context of these type of events. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and check this out. It's a pretty long original video of nearly 32 minutes. So buckle in and hopefully you enjoy this. I'll be chiming in and on things that I think maybe need maybe some explanation, or if they miss some things that I feel like are important. That's always been my job, and hopefully that's what you're here for. All right, the original video link is down below. Make sure you support that. View, like, subscribe. Real Life Lore does some really good content. So I think you will be very pleased by following their channel more. All right, and with that, let's get started.
This video is made possible by CuriosityStream and Nebula. Watch another brand new full-length companion video to this one in my ongoing Modern Conflicts series that explains the entire course of the 2008 Russian invasion of Georgia, as well as the entire war so far between Russia and Ukraine since 2014 in the Donbass.
All these things are put together.
You can access by signing up for the CuriosityStream Nebula bundle deal for less than $15 a year at curiositystream.com/reallifelore. Throughout the past few months, there has been almost constant news and coverage in the West about Russia's imminent plans to invade Ukraine.
Started large-scale military drills this morning.
Yeah, that might be something you don't even know. Maybe you've only heard about this over the last 2 weeks, but if you're looking closer, this has not come out of nowhere. The mobilization of troops and some of the threats and things like that, and I'm assuming they're going to go through that. But yeah, this might be going a lot deeper than some of you might have thought.
And this is a very dangerous moment.
Stoking fears of an invasion.
More than 2,000 troops, according to American intelligence, sent within the 24 hours.
American citizens should leave now.
On the morning of February the 24th, these fears proved to be well-founded. Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, effectively declared war on Ukraine and authorized the Russian military to invade the country. Explosions were quickly reported afterwards across the country, and immediately prior to this declaration, the Russian army had amassed around 200,000 soldiers, along with their tanks, artillery, equipment, and field hospitals across their border, and many others inside of Belarus along their border with Ukraine.
You know, 200,000 troops, that is substantial. Whether it leads to an invasion or not, historically speaking, when you see that type of thing, which you don't see that much in history, that is alarming, right? And whether it's going to be used just as an intimidating force or whatever, mobilization is often seen as the cause of war. Let's already give some context. Back in World War I, the kind of justification, say, that the Germans used for declaring war on Russia, which Russia had not declared war on Germany, was that Russia was mobilizing. They were mobilizing before basically anyone else. And that was seen basically as an act of war. So sometimes, again, these kind of mobilizations, they can be seen in different ways. Some people don't see them as an act of war. Some people will. And as you can imagine, it probably comes down to who's doing this. If you're the mobilizing force, you might say, no, this is just some preparations and whatever. And you may even say it's related, but like, you may not say, no, this is not an act of war. But again, if you're on the other side, you might see that as a far aggressive because it would be worrisome.
For comparison, this is nearly the same size as the entire Ukrainian military, at about the same number of troops sent by the United States when invading Iraq in 2003.
That's some very important context. So that 200,000, was that just out of nowhere? No, maybe that's seen, whether, if you want to look at for the mobilizing force as a fair level of mobilization, we say, hey, we're just mobilizing to the amount that you have, right? And not trying to outdo you, to mean that, I guess, I don't know, if it's going to be a fight, then it's going to be a fair fight. Now, if you want to go back to World War I again, the army sizes varied greatly. Russia had the largest standing army in Europe on the eve of World War I with about 6 million, in comparison to Germany's about 4.5 million. But yes, you can see how numbers make a big deal too.
This is certainly large enough to be an effective invasion force. Even further, the Russian government has recognized the independence of the two breakaway states inside of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, and ordered Russian troops inside of both. When factoring in the Russian...
Now, I'm sure they might talk about it. Those areas, as compared to other parts of Ukraine, have a lot more pro-Russian sentiment, and Russia is seeing that. When they see that type of thing, even if it's in a foreign country, similar with Crimea, which is the peninsula down below there, where you have a far more pro-Russian population, that nations, and I'm saying in general, Russia's doing it here, may view that as justification that those regions should be annexed or assimilated into your culture, because they have such high numbers of support. But that would, again, be viewed differently by the nation that currently holds those territories, in this case, Ukraine.
Military presence already stationed in Crimea, you can quickly begin seeing that the Russians have Ukraine almost entirely surrounded. And now that war has broken out, it has...
Now, the Crimea annexation happened in 2014, so that was not... The invasion of Ukraine did not happen right now. It had already happened years ago.
The potential to unleash the most serious conflict seen in Europe since the Second World War.
That's what everyone keeps saying.
The biggest question on everybody's mind this entire time has been this: what exactly does Vladimir Putin and Russia want with Ukraine? And the answer is, of course, it's complicated.
Good.
The origins of what Putin...
That is a fair thing that not enough people say. Everybody likes to make just simple, overarching, explain-it-all statements. And I know it can be frustrating as somebody trying to learn about a conflict that you don't know, and you hear them say, why is this happening? You say, well, it's complicated. A lot of people, they don't like that. That doesn't work with their brain. They want a cut and dry thing to explain with. But honesty has to mean something, right? And that's what we need to do in these evaluations. And again, you may not know it's complicated if you don't understand the history. That's what we're doing here.
Wants today are rooted in what happened more than 3 decades ago, back in the early 1990s,
Please
when
go
the Soviet
before that,
Union
though.
first collapsed. For centuries before this event, whether
Please
as part of the
go
Soviet
before
Union
the
or
Soviet
the
Union.
Russian Empire, the modern countries we know of today as Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and others had all been a part of the same country.
All right. I'm hoping, and I did this before. If you saw my video, where I responded to Johnny Harris's video about this, I was consistently talking about how you have to go further back than the Soviet Union on this stuff. You have to go back to Russian Empire. You got to go back to 1700s to understand the deeper context. If you just look at this in the context of the fall of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, you are missing things. You're missing generations more of history in this region, because it goes so much deeper than the past few decades. And we'll see if they get into that. I don't see a lot of videos necessarily going that deep. And I understand too, you'd be talking about videos that would be insanely long, but if it comes to that, I'll, and they don't go over that stuff as much, I'll be sure to chime in.
And their people...
I mean, right here they did. They're showing with the green here, Russian Empire extents, which you can see goes all the way into kind of the western half of Poland. And again, pushing much further west, which was important for the growth of the Russian Empire. They wanted to get into Eastern Europe more, wanted more access to warm water ports, and I mean, they were an empire, right? And led by people like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, who were pushing this stuff on. Western Europe.
People had largely moved between all of them across generations. These places are all deeply and intimately connected by their shared history.
Yes.
And for decades, that history
Slavic
involved
history.
being widely recognized as one of the world's most dominant and formidable global superpowers. But all of that changed in late 1991, when suddenly the sweeping United
Is that where
Empire
we're starting?
that
Just the
existed
fall?
in some form or another for centuries collapsed and left in its place 15 newly independent republics.
So we're going really recent here. Maybe not as much. I mean, again, it's early in the video. I'm 3 minutes into a 30-minute video. So we're just going with the breakaway states. I mean, that is more of the recent history, but again, it goes a lot deeper. And depending on if they, by the way, they talk about it or not, you can check out some of the other videos related to Russia-Ukraine situation that I've talked about, where I do talk more of the Russian Empire and going back further to that.
Today, the largest of them, Russia, has only half of the population that the former United Soviet Union had, and she possesses an economy that's only moderately larger than Spain's, a country with only a third of the population that ceased being a great power back in the 18th century. At the same time, the massive amounts of territories that were once dominated from the central government in Moscow have been shrinking almost continuously ever since. During the Cold War, there were two rival competing military alliances on the European continent.
Get some NATO
the
here.
North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in the west, and the Warsaw Pact in the east.
Now that NATO map is not even the original one that started in 1949. There were fewer countries even than that. It ended up changing again over time. I mean, that's doesn't matter much in this part of it, but used to be smaller. And if you look at that map, that's another thing you want to look at. Look at a NATO map from 1949 to basically 1999. So a 50-year process, and you'll see what looks like a rapid expansion from west to east into Europe. That, when you look at it from that perspective, would look very alarming to Russia. We'll see if they talk about that, though, with the Warsaw Pact being the counter to that, which was started about 6 years later as a counter to NATO. A lot of Warsaw Pact nations are now part of NATO, which again is extra worrisome because they were once in alliances, military alliances with Russia.
Moscow didn't outright rule the countries of the Warsaw Pact, but they were effectively locked into Moscow's orbit as
Puppets.
thralls or puppet states.
Yeah.
From Moscow's perspective, these states provided a massive buffer against any potential military incursion from their primary Cold War rivals to the west in NATO. You see, from the Netherlands in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east, this whole part of Europe is dominated by a geographic feature called the North European Plain.
Sure. It's flat, good for agriculture as long as you're not going too far north or to the right this way this way in the map here. Love the perspective
Almost entirely
here,
flat, the plain is shaped like a funnel with a very narrow width in northern Germany, but with a mouth that opens up increasingly wider as it approaches the Ural Mountains. As the open plain gets wider across the east, it becomes increasingly difficult to defend across its entire length. And as a result, from the perspective of any regime based in Moscow,
you can see where they're going with
regardless of
this.
the time period and regardless of the ideology, it is imperative to expand control westwards across as much
Make
of
a
this
choke
open
point.
plain as possible in order to narrow the gap that they need to defend in the event of a conflict with the West.
Okay, that makes sense. Now I see why they're flipping the perspective of this. By the way, we need to do that more with maps. We are so fixated on the north, east, west, south fixation. We understand that no, the world is, even though this is two-dimensional, it gives you again more like a three-dimensional feel to it. So all of a sudden it makes a lot more sense. And by the way, that whole like widening of Russia, I feel like that's got to be something that has been underestimated by the nations of Europe that have invaded Russia before, specifically like Napoleon and France and then Germany in World War II, of understanding that the further you get in, the harder it is to defeat Russia from a geographic perspective, because it gets so dang vast and large, especially if you have to get to Moscow, which is what you have to do essentially to take Russia, if you want to call it that. But it's, you can see in the map here, that's like almost the widest point of Russia is right where Moscow is, right? If you're talking about going down to the Caucasus region and then into Finland, Yeah, people underestimate this and how you have to spread yourself. So I can see what they're saying from a strategic point of view. And I haven't looked at it this much, especially I like how they did this perspective of now you really realize the funneling aspect of being able to go from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and how controlling that territory right here, if you can see my mouse, is really important. And you can see that's where that's going to be after the fall of the Soviet Union, is still at that choke point.
During the Cold War, the control of this plain by a regime in Moscow was at its greatest historical extent, and was exerted either outright or by proxy from the Urals all the way through East Germany. And the entire wider section of the funnel was firmly controlled by Moscow, with Austria and Finland remaining neutral, and Yugoslavia a non-aligned communist state. The only fronts that Moscow at the time had to truly worry about against NATO were across the Sudeten Mountains, the Black Sea, and a narrow line across the North European plain in central Germany, all easily defensible positions. Any invasion of the Soviet world from the west across these geographic frontiers would have been incredibly difficult. But in the 30 years since 1991, the situation has changed dramatically against Moscow's favor. Today, the former Warsaw Pact territories of East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria are all a part of NATO.
And that just right there, again, this stuff started happening, from the 80s into the 90s, and then even more recent decades. So you can see from that point, a strategic point, how alarming, I guess, that could be from the Russian perspective. If you really truly are, fixated on the idea that the West is still very much your enemy and is potentially an invading force, again, which is the context that people like Joseph Stalin used as to why they didn't allow the states in Eastern Europe that had been invaded by the Soviet Union in World War II to gain their independence, that they were justifiably a buffer zone, right, from the Baltic to the Black Sea against a future invasion. Now, is that truly like the number one reason why people like Stalin would say something like that? And then I think you'd hear something similar, from Vladimir Putin necessarily. But is that more the reason, or is it more on the side of imperialism? Don't know, but at least from that perspective of militarily, you can see why that would necessarily be alarming, because there essentially is no buffer anymore.
While the former Soviet republics themselves of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia all are as well. This reality has pushed the NATO front lines significantly further to the...
We'll see if they get to it. Kaliningrad right here, which is, if you didn't know, is a Russian-controlled part, or Russian-controlled area. Right here is technically part of Russia, even though it is not connected there. And maybe that wouldn't have been as big of an idea from the Russian perspective if the military alliance, NATO military alliance, didn't go to the Baltic right here. Which means that like Kaliningrad could be technically surrounded by NATO militaries, could have that, and you wouldn't be able to directly supply them. So, it would have been nice, I guess, for the Russian perspective to be able to control those Baltic states, but from just a military perspective. But now it's even worse because they're surrounded by NATO nations.
East across the wider section of the North European plain, and a separated Russian territory between the mainland and the Kaliningrad exclave here across what's known as the Suwalki Gap. If you're sitting in the Kremlin in Moscow and you still believe that NATO is a hostile military alliance, or could become one in the future, then this situation understandably looks pretty grim. But it's not totally lost yet. In the years following the breakup of the Soviet Union, many of the newly independent republics established and joined their own military alliance called the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO, which in Europe consists of Russia, Belarus, and Armenia, but not Ukraine, which has remained a sort of neutral zone between NATO in the west and the CSTO in the east.
And maybe be considered the most important buffer zone from the Russian perspective, at least, especially when you're talking about modern regions. If you feel like, again, like the Baltic states are just, they're a far gone conclusion, or far gone from ever being able to be regained, or Poland or something like that. You find out more and more, I guess, why the Ukraine is seen as more and more important, because it's like the last of those buffer states. Belarus is very Russian controlled that way, so that isn't necessarily in as much fear as something like Ukraine is.
And now, within this lens, you can easily see why Ukraine is currently and always will be a geographic core interest to Moscow.
And you got to say it. Black Sea control is it's how you access Russian resources through the Black Sea, and that's why Crimea was always important. Going back to like Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, we're going back to like the 1700s. Why this region here was so important to Russia, because they did not have access to warm water ports and maritime trade routes through the Black Sea or military positions in the Black Sea. It's why it was so important and was tried for decades and decades and decades to try to conquer this region, and is still so important to them, and why they invested and took Crimea seriously.
If Ukraine is within Moscow's orbit, then it pushes the CSTO's and Moscow's defensive lines to the Carpathian Mountains in the southwest, and it narrows their exposure across the North European plain to only the eastern border of Poland. And while the Baltic states do lie across the plain as well, CSTO forces could easily encircle them by rapidly advancing across the narrow Suwalki Gap between Kaliningrad and Belarus, and cut them off from the rest of NATO, meaning that they aren't as grave of a geographical threat. Conversely, however, if Ukraine became a NATO member state, it would surge the NATO front lines far beyond the Carpathian Mountains and far across the wider section of the North European plain, and place the new defensible front line across nearly 2,300 kilometers of open, hard to defend flat land, the easternmost section of which would only be a little more than 300 kilometers away from Volgograd, which, if taken,
formerly
would shut down the entire Volga River and cut off Russia's valuable oil and gas resources coming up from around the Caspian Sea from
why Volgograd, which again was Stalingrad, renamed, but was an important target for both the Axis powers, Germany in World War II, and for the Soviet Union to be able to defend it because of its location here on the Volga River. But it is a major energy product trade zone, right, with oil, and why that was such an important thing, because in World War II, it was so important for oil production, and a major reason why Germany went towards that region instead of going all into Moscow. But that's a story of a different time if you want to look at World War II history there. But again, they're just reasserting how important this region is, and how there's just so many important regions that Russia has to, or at least they feel they need to, be able to defend at all costs.
From the rest of the country, as nearly happened during the Second World War, back when the city was better known as Stalingrad.
By the way, biggest battle in world history, 2 million dead in that battle.
Even further, Belarus, a friendly and loyal CSTO state that is often considered a mere extension of Moscow itself, would suddenly become an indefensible salient protruding deep into the NATO front lines.
True, you look at that.
Entirely by NATO territory on 3
Belarus
flanks.
looks very exposed
Thus,
from that
Ukraine's
area.
outright control by Moscow, or at least neutrality, is essential to the defense of the CSTO and Russia.
Now, what I want to make sure, though, is as I'm talking about it, is I'm not leading a discussion or whatever here where I'm trying to say that, military strategic positioning is the most important thing in foreign relations and all that. It's like totally ignoring it totally ignores, if you just take this approach of the human element about cultures, for example, and self-determination and all that. This is purely right now, or 9 minutes into the video, of a military perspective, and looking at it from the perspective of the West is your enemy and you're going to be invaded, and it's just a matter of fact, so you have to prioritize more than anything else your whole foreign policy on military strategy and not these other human and social elements. I want to make sure I declare that as it goes on. If you're getting ready to click away, that I'm trying to make some position about Russian defense or defending Russian things like that. I'm not.
If you believe that NATO is a hostile aggressor or could become one in the future. But all of this is really only the
seem to be on the same page
of what Russia and Putin want from Ukraine. The biggest thing they want of all is energy. While their overall economy is little larger than Spain's, Russia remains a global superpower through the lens of energy resources.
Especially gas,
and it's specifically
coal,
oil and gas that is the most critical component to understand about Russia's worldwide ambitions.
Again, we'll see if they get to it, but I want to make sure I understand. Places like Germany have like 50% of their energy comes from Russia, And that makes this stuff very, very testy, and why you might see European nations right now be a little bit more reluctant to step into more direct aid to Ukraine is because how much power Russia holds over the energy sources of a lot of Europe. And they could shut down energy in these countries, like just absolutely shut it down. But then that's that perspective of like, well, like, yeah, Russia might have that leverage, but at the same time, Russia has to have those funds. Their economy is built upon these, so much is built upon this exporting that it would be against both sides' interests to try to use energy source trade as some kind of bargaining tool or leverage tool in this conflict. So does that make it kind of just like wipe out that now it's not going to be a leverage tool because it's mutually beneficial? I don't know. I think we still have to see that at the time, again, of me making this video right now, which is still early in the conflict.
Across multiple vast oil fields, Russia is the world's second largest producer of oil, ahead of even Saudi Arabia. While at the same time, Russia also possesses the world's largest proven reserves of natural gas, largely across Siberia, which has enabled Russia to become the world's leading exporter of natural gas.
And there's pipeline. They're talking about going through the Baltic and stuff to get places like Germany, and so that's a big threat too, where they've, you know, before have tried to, you know, they try to avoid, if you can, you know, these pipelines that carry natural gas over multiple countries, because the geopolitics of a certain country could, you know, affect, you know, the energy source transmission. You know, if you have country A, country B, country C, and there's a problem with country B, then that blocks off countries A and C in their trade route. So they've had this pipeline that's been talked about and being used and stuff that goes, you know, tries to bypass that by going through the Baltic to get to Central Europe.
Revenues gained from the sale of all these oil and gas exports are the literal foundation for the modern Russian state and Russian power, because they provide as much as 50% of the entire Russian government's budget and represent about 30% of Russia's entire GDP. Russia has...
And money trumps everything, you guys. You got to understand, money does trump everything, more than politics and social things and all that. Economics, they just fuel everything, especially in the modern era.
Use the
Maybe
vast money earned from selling oil and gas abroad to fund their military, pay off debts, save cash, and finance its own restoration as a global great power. Russia is therefore effectively a petrostate, just like Saudi Arabia or Iran, and is the only petrostate located in Europe, at least for now. For you see,
being so reliant on one form of economic development is also very, very dangerous for you to do, because if circumstances happen where that thing that you export or whatever, that's the key to your entire economy, if that ever comes obsolete, then you are in big trouble. And you know, people talk about that with oil especially, but natural gas is still, it's, you know, super important too, though.
Despite these massive geological blessings, they also come with a number of geographical catches from Moscow's perspective. Most of their gas is sold off to the hungry customers in the European Union.
Right.
So much so that 35% of the EU's entire gas supply comes from Russia alone.
And some countries are more like
Germany,
50%.
the world's fourth largest economy, who imports nearly half of their natural gas from Russia.
Right.
This flow of gas towards Germany and Europe across this complex system of pipelines provides critical revenues for the Russian government to function and provides critical heat for European cities during the winter. So
I'm filming this video on Saturday, February 26th, and within the last 24 hours, there was a development with the German perspective, and then it made more sense because people were like, Germany, why aren't you going in more into the situation and giving again, not just like defensive aid to Ukraine, but why not offensive aid, missiles and stuff like that? And when I heard that stat, the 50% stat before, about that, then you're like, okay, it makes sense from that perspective, from a contextual perspective. Once again, that if you just really anger, say, the Russians there, they could, technically speaking, shut you out from your energy sources. And like I said, Germany gets half of this gas from Russia, which would ruin them, right? But the decision within the last 24 hours, though, is, Germany now, I don't know if it's because of the pressure, they were just waiting longer, has decided they would put offensive materials, war materials into Ukraine. So it'll be interesting to see how, coming back to this in the days coming or whatever, if that relationship for gas sale, if anything happens as a result of that, do they shut it down, raise prices? Don't know. But like I said earlier in the video, it's mutually beneficial, whether you're at war or not, for these two countries, specifically Germany and Russia we're talking about, to have that trade still going on. But again, can be used as leverage.
And so both sides heavily rely upon the other here. Any disruption in this trade relationship would be disastrous from Moscow's perspective. And Ukraine is the most likely place for such a disruption to happen in the future.
I guess a question we could ask though is, the cutting off of the trade of natural gas, who hurts more? The individual countries in Europe or Russia? What do you think? Put a comment down below.
Back during the Soviet times, when Russia and Ukraine were both one country, pipelines were built across Ukraine almost like a bridge that transported gas directly from the Siberian sources to the customers in Europe. But then, all of a sudden, after the USSR's collapse, Ukraine was an independent country who was demanding tariffs to the tune of billions of dollars a year from Russia in order to continue using their country as a gas bridge to Europe. And Russia had no other choice but to agree, because the pipeline infrastructure anywhere else didn't yet exist. As late as 2005, 80% of Russia's gas exports heading to Europe were still flowing across pipelines through Ukraine. But in the decades since...
By the way, I got to give shout out to the real life lore for all the data they're putting in, especially this economic stuff about percentages of going through certain countries. That's awesome. Great work by them.
Russia has sought to solve this over-reliance on Ukraine by building multiple new pipelines that avoid Ukraine entirely, like Yamal Europe across loyal Belarus, Nord Stream 1 and 2 beneath the Baltic that go directly from Russia to Germany, Moscow's largest single customer, along with South Stream, Blue Stream, and Turk Stream beneath the Black Sea. By 2024, Russia has plans to completely cease all of their gas exports through Ukraine entirely, and the government will save billions of dollars in tariffs as a result. But that is hardly what has been so threatening about Ukraine recently. Significantly more menacing to the perspective of Moscow was the discovery, for the first time in early 2012, that Ukraine's exclusive economic zone within the Black Sea may contain more than 2 trillion cubic meters worth of natural gas.
I think I heard of that. I forgot about that. I think I'd heard of that, which is bringing up a bunch of conflicts. Like, for example, there's still, I think, some disagreement upon how far away, how distant from your shoreline do you as a country claim control of. And there's some overlapping, I believe, almost looks like a Venn diagram of sometimes nations. I know with Turkey, that becomes an issue too with that as well. But yeah, about who claims what. That's a different set of issues there, though.
Largely concentrated around the Crimean Peninsula. To make matters even more interesting, further technological advancements in the early 2010s that enabled the successful drilling of natural gas and oil from shale rock unlocked the potential shale gas hotspots for Ukraine around Donetsk and Kharkiv in the east and around the Carpathians in the west. Beginning in 2012, there was suddenly a very real possibility that almost out of nowhere, Ukraine had the world's 14th largest reserve of natural gas just behind Australia and Iraq.
Well, is Russia going to think they have claim to that because it was a former territory, or just for the fact that now maybe other places in Europe can bypass Russia?
Relatively poor
that
country,
seems like a bigger
Ukraine
concern.
lacked the finances, the technology, or the equipment to successfully harvest any of these resources in any large quantities. But that all changed when, shortly afterwards, the Ukrainian government began granting exploration and drilling rights to the likes of Shell and Exxon. It was suddenly possible that within a few years, these Western companies would enable Ukraine to transform into Europe's second petrostate, which would have not only been a direct and serious competitor to Russia's Russia's own gas supply to the European Union.
This stuff's
and
been new to
thus,
me.
at the
This is
same
interesting.
time, a major threat to the Russian government's budget and GDP, but would have also provided the easy path of eventual
NATO.
Ukrainian admission into the European Union and NATO as well. And this is what's really, in my opinion, what this whole situation is truly about.
NATO membership or the natural resources? That would be my question. Up to this point, I've always thought it's NATO. Maybe it's not 100% that, but we'll see what they say.
In 2012, at the time when these discoveries were initially made, the man in charge of Ukraine was Viktor Yanukovych, a pro-Russian politician who was keeping Ukraine more politically aligned with the interests of Moscow. So long as he was president, these discoveries were not directly threatening to Russia. But
That, by the way, shows you a lot of the changing politics potentially of Ukraine, because they've had far more like anti Russian leaders, which people would put Zelensky in right now.
when suddenly in February 2014, his government was toppled in a pro-EU and pro-Western revolution in Kiev, Moscow was very quick to take the opportunity to invade some of Ukraine, seize the Crimean Peninsula, and annex it in the name of historical claims and protecting ethnic Russians. But by seizing Crimea...
Right. Now, a question would be, because that's what so much is talked about now. They don't talk about the natural resource and stuff. It's about history. Now Russians are using it for history, and specifically Vladimir Putin, because you can read all of his speeches and stuff. He's very deep into the history of Russia and Russian nationalism, Russian greatness, and that sort of thing, and has made, again, statements that a lot of people seem a lot more combative than what he's using as justification now, because there are these things that people bring up where Vladimir Putin said, like, Ukraine is like a fake state, it's Russia, it's totally just Russia. But you don't necessarily see that in the public addresses now, but are things that have been said in the past, which is why a lot of people don't buy a lot of what Vladimir Putin says as justification for these things, that at its core, it still believes in the Ukraine situation. Ukraine should completely be Russian, right? But again, that's only based off of maybe some previous statements. I'm sure people might say it's out of context or outdated or, whatever, but that's not what I'm going to comment on. But nevertheless, what people speak about.
The Russians also took direct control of 2/3 of Ukraine's coastline and, by extension, the vast majority of Ukraine's maritime exclusive economic zone.
Sevastopol.
And most critically, an estimated 80% of Ukraine's potential offshore oil and gas reserves. In addition,
And again, they're saying that annexation of Korea is after the discovery of all this oil, so timing?
Millions of dollars worth of drilling equipment and other assets in the peninsula were seized by the Russians, all of which completely crippled the Ukrainian government's future potential to challenge Russia's gas supremacy in Europe. To make matters even worse,
Side
from
bonus
Ukraine's
for the Russians?
perspective, the areas of Ukraine that are the most rich in shale gas are located very near to the most major conflict zones encouraged and funded from Moscow, with the Donetsk and Luhansk rebellions here,
right in the middle of
Transnistria breakaway republic in Moldova
I did not know
over
that.
here, which, in my view, is not a coincidence. As a result, Shell and Exxon
Need to see some evidence of that, but nevertheless, like I said a minute ago, if you caught me, bonus points or something for taking that.
Backed out from all of their contracts with the Ukrainian government shortly afterwards, leaving Ukraine with no capability to extract the remaining resources themselves, and no capability to challenge Russia's occupation of Crimea. From the perspective of Putin and his regime, these were all mandatory actions to take in order to curb a Western-oriented Ukraine from ever selling major supplies of gas to Europe that would threaten his own regime's primary source of wealth and power. Ukraine had to be dismembered to protect himself and the other oligarchs who are in power. But there's more.
We gotta notice. We gotta do that. Vladimir Putin and the Russian government is not just propped up with the interest of one person. There is a handful of extremely powerful oligarchs that give Vladimir Putin his power, and Vladimir Putin gives them their economic power. There's an oligarchy there under the surface here.
Putin, Russia can't ever give Crimea back to Ukraine because it would surrender the entire exclusive economic zone and all of the gas resources within it back, along with the strategic port city of Sevastopol, one of the very few year-round ice-free ports that the Russian Navy can use and needs to operate throughout the Black Sea and the Mediterranean.
That's why Russian Empire invaded that region. So it used to be Turkish, controlled by Turkey, and yeah, there you go. That's why Crimea is most important. And Sevastopol, shoot, maybe it's the most important city in Russia, and again, was out of Russia's hands for decades until the annexation.
If Crimea was ever returned to Ukraine and Ukraine joined NATO, they would regain their ability to threaten the Russian government's primary source of revenue, and the Russian Navy's most geostrategically valuable port would be lost forever. But Ukraine has some pressure that it can and has been applying itself.
Okay.
Naturally speaking, the geography of Crimea is that it's almost an island,
It is.
only loosely.
I did some just curiosity. I love Google Earth almost every night while I'm trying to get to sleep. You know, a lot of people read and stuff, and I like to do that too. But one thing I like to do is just go on Google Earth and look at stuff. And I've looked at Crimea a lot. And yeah, there's very few access points they've had to build. There's very few roads that get across it. It's actually pretty easy to shut off from mainland like Ukraine.
Connected to the rest of Europe and covered by dry and arid steppes and some salty marshes with very little fresh water for people or agriculture. Prior to the Russian invasion and annexation, the vast majority of Crimea's freshwater supply, like 85% of it, came down into the peninsula from a canal built during the
And I
Soviet
think this
era
gets
that
shut
diverted
down.
water from the Dnieper River. But after the Russians took it over in 2014,
Yeah,
the
they shut it
Ukrainians
off.
weren't exactly in the mood to continue sending down the water, and they filled up the canal within their remaining borders to the north with cement and blocked the flow of all this water down into the now Russian-occupied Crimea.
That was a Vice video I think I watched recently where they talked about it was life in Crimea, and it was a few years ago. But that's been a huge issue for Crimea is they don't have access to that water now, and their reservoirs are and canal again are completely drained because Ukraine's like, all right, you have Crimea, but doesn't mean you have right to our canal that we built that goes from our country to this part of your country now. So they shut it off, and it's been damaging for that for agriculture, and it's been a major infrastructure project for the Russians today is to get water for agriculture in Crimea because again they shut off most of it.
As a result, Crimea has ever since been essentially dying a death from 1,000 cuts, as it steadily recedes back into the dry and arid steppe of history, while modern climate change is only making everything even worse, as 2020 was the driest year ever on record in Crimea since record-keeping began 150 years ago. As a result, the Russian government is struggling to maintain its hold. The capital city Simferopol's reservoir is today less than 7% full, and the city has been having to ration water supplies.
Yeah, so where do they get it now?
After the Russians built a nearly $4 billion bridge across the Kerch Strait here to connect the peninsula over to the Russian mainland, shipping in water is difficult, and life for the more than 2 million people on the peninsula is getting harder after the annexation, not better.
That bridge has been really important because if you know that there was no connection there between before the annexation between Crimea, which would be Ukraine, and Russia. There was no there. That was a huge project that they only completed recently since the Crimean annexation there.
People on the peninsula is getting harder after
Otherwise,
the annexation.
as you can tell, Russia would not be able to get access to the Crimean Peninsula there.
Not better. The Russian government is having to spend billions of dollars a year to financially prop up Crimea, and it's largely all because of this canal being shut down by the Ukrainians over on the other side. And Ukraine is obviously not in any kind of mood to open it back up again. As a result, the current crisis in Ukraine can also be seen through the lens of climate and water conflict, and it's one of the biggest reasons why Russia is doing what it's doing now. The current Prime Minister of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has stated on multiple occasions that the primary goal going forward for the Ukrainian nation is the reclamation of the Crimean Peninsula from Russia. Currently, Ukraine has no realistic capability to challenge the
Russia's not gonna. They're not gonna do that. They're not going to allow that. That would be a major thing, I think, if Ukraine does try to bring back Crimea. However, now let's say Ukraine got a ton of aid from the West and was able to, drive out this Russian invasion. would they like to keep that momentum and keep that going and use this now probably belief that the Russians were unjustified in maybe Ukraine, like building upon the current situation? That would be the best time potentially to retake Crimea would be right now with that, because the anti-Russian sentiment for Ukraine or for Ukrainian politics is at an all-time high right now. But then maybe you would see a lot more Russian interference here to hold that.
Overwhelmingly more powerful and capable Russian military. But in the future, were Ukraine to join NATO and a murky conflict breaks out between themselves and Russia over Crimea, or in the eastern rebel-occupied Donbass, where it may be unclear who started it, it's hypothetical that Ukraine could trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which states that, quote, if a NATO ally is the victim of an armed attack, each and every other member of the alliance will consider this act of violence as an armed attack against all members and will take the actions it deems necessary to assist the ally attacked.
There you go. Boy, that's a powerful article. As long as people actually abide by it. But it's supposed to be a deterrent for anyone else outside of NATO. An attack against one nation for any circumstances and any nation is an attack against all. And that would be then bringing together basically the biggest coalition, the biggest military alliance in history.
Therefore, in the future, the fear of those in power in the Kremlin is that Ukraine will bring in the rest of NATO to fight Russia in taking back Crimea.
Yep,
and
that's what I was
that is
saying.
a war that Moscow knows it will lose. Not only because of NATO's much more advanced
doesn't mean that they'll not attempt to fight and maybe gain allies. That's when people get concerned about what if the Russians were able to get like China on their side, which is taking a kind of interesting lukewarm kind of position right now. But maybe that's more of a discussion for another time, which is China's role in this. Or potential
military
role.
capabilities, but because of Russia's own internal demographic problems. Ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia's deaths have exceeded her births, while the nation's fertility rate has been among the
Are they gonna talk about the
lowest in the
Holodomor?
world. And so the country's
I hope so.
population has been shrinking almost continuously ever since. But since the COVID-19 pandemic began in 2020, this shrinking population problem has only gotten even worse. And Russia is currently undergoing its largest peacetime decline in people ever in all of recorded
Yeah, I remember
history.
hearing that. Russia's like losing population, or their population growth has become stagnant, interestingly,
than during the 1990s, right after the Soviet collapse. Right now, Russia has around 25 million men within the country who are of military service age. But the government knows that as time continues on, that potential pool of manpower is only going to get smaller and smaller.
True.
Therefore, it could be reasoned behind the inner walls of the Kremlin that the longer Russia waits to act upon Ukraine, the more difficult it is going to become in the future. And so the earlier, the better.
You think they're looking that far down the road,
Crimea,
though?
and by maintaining conflicts in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, Russia has so far succeeded in keeping Ukraine out of NATO. And by building up troops along the border and hosting joint military exercises in Belarus, Moscow is further able to signal to Ukraine that they are in danger.
And that's what it's, remember, at the surface level, what this is supposed to all be about, which is keeping Ukraine out of NATO. And Russia believing that maybe this application of force will, one, either, again, keep their population, their government, their officials from staying out of NATO, right? Or, I think this is more far-fetched, but you've seen Vladimir Putin say that the Ukrainian people should basically stand up and demand a regime change, which I don't think is going to happen. I mean, it seems like in a lot of ways, Vladimir Zelensky, the current president, is probably going to get more popular because of this. So this may end up backfiring. And that brings in another thing, by the way, that people are accusing Russian intelligence of, is that doing this is actually going to make Ukraine more likely to join NATO. And by the way, not just Ukraine, but also other states like Finland, for example, that may see that this may influence them to actually go towards it more. I mean, it could have the other effect, and somewhere like Finland, other border state that's not part of NATO, may be like, all right, we don't want to deal with this Ukraine situation, so we're going to make sure we stay out. But again, it could easily, and maybe more so, lead to other buffer, not neutral, non-aligned states to join NATO. So there's the potential of this being a massive backfire for Russia.
Moscow is further able to signal to Ukraine that they are in danger, which can panic investors in the Ukrainian government and damage the economy even further, and which forces Ukraine to spend even more money on their own military and defense, taking away vital cash that they could be using to further develop their own natural gas infrastructure. And of course, Russia has been fueling a war inside of Ukraine in the east now for years, ever since 2014, that has greatly depleted the Ukrainian government's time, manpower, and resources. After being taken over by pro-Russian separatists following Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea, both Donetsk and Luhansk declared their independence from Ukraine 8 years ago, and after being supported financially and militarily from Russia, have continuously been fighting a war against the Ukrainian government ever since that has already claimed the lives of more than 14,000 people.
This is something very, very few people know, that this pro-Russia, pro-Ukraine conflict in the Ukraine is a civil war that has gone on for years. Right, it's almost up to a decade.
For years, most of the territory of each has been controlled by the Ukrainian government. But just a few days ago, Russia, for the first time, officially recognized both as fully independent countries separate from Ukraine and deployed their troops into each.
Right, and declared them as peacekeeping troops because they believed that now there was a legal justification for the independence of these two regions and that Russia was going to be there. And that's what people were getting a little nervous, because that's where the Russian troops first started coming in, was in this region. Again, that could be justified as now being, again, whether it's independent or fully independent or not, but pro-Russian. So there was seemingly more justification to put the troops there than what's happening right now as troops are getting closer to places like Kiev, which are far from these regions.
Right now, as I made this video, it's still unclear what exactly Putin is ultimately planning for Ukraine. He may only be plotting a limited strike into the country in order to permanently sever both Donetsk and Luhansk from the country, as he did with Crimea 8 years previously, and effectively occupy each. He may also be plotting a further limited strike from Crimea in order to neutralize the block in the canal in order to free up Crimea's struggling water supply. He may be planning to go further, though, to ensure that this situation never happens again, and push Russian territory all the way to at least some of the Dnieper River to simultaneously stabilize Crimea's geographic position by freeing up the water supply, deny even more of Ukraine's coastline and access to natural gas reserves, and set up a stronger potential defensive line against any attack from the west along the Dnieper River's banks.
So I thought I'd add this because, again, I don't know if they're to talk about it, but there's an interesting thing going around in Chernobyl. So Chernobyl is on a river, the Pripyat River, I believe, that feeds into the Dnieper, which is the lifeblood of Kiev and central Ukraine. And it's one of the places, it's on the way basically from the Belarusian border, which is where a lot of the troops came from, Russian troops. You basically go through the exclusion zone of Chernobyl on the way to Kiev. Now, the exclusion zone is that area around the Chernobyl power plant, which hopefully you know the history of that, the great meltdown, that happened there, explosion that created, again, this zone called the exclusion zone, where they ban basically people from living there, right? It's this big region because of the radiation levels and all that. But it has been retaken, and people were kind of freaking out about it. Like, there's this big cover that they built over the Chernobyl power plant that helps keep radiation, and people are worried. And I thought I even heard a rumor, I don't think it was, and I don't know if it ended up being true, that like they cracked the shell of it, and that means that, the radiation can get out. But like, is that something almost like a suicide bomb, like a suicide thing that the Russians could use and hold as hostage? Is like, we'll blow up Chernobyl, you know what I mean? But nevertheless, it's more about than anything, because some people were saying that didn't understand the geography. It's more the fact that Chernobyl is on the way to Kiev. Kyiv, by the way, which I got to make sure I say, because I've been saying it wrong my whole life, and a whole bunch of people now are saying Kyiv, which is, I guess, the legit way you should be saying the city.
Alternatively, he may also be planning a southern takeover of Ukraine, which would simultaneously bring Donetsk and Luhansk into Russia, link up Crimea with the Dnieper River and the canal, block off Ukraine from the rest of the Black Sea, and transform the country into a landlocked state.
Those green lines being connected could be a really big deal.
Offshore gas deposits, and link up mainland Russian territory with both Crimea and loyal Transnistria in the west. Or he may really be planning an all-out assault to take over the entire country, so as to guarantee that Russia and the CSTO's defensive lines against NATO are pushed further back towards the more narrow opening of the North European plain between the Carpathian Mountains and the Baltic Sea across the border of Poland.
Now, if that latter phase that he's talking about is actually true, that would put the NATO in a lot of pressure, which, although Ukraine is not a NATO state, but Ukraine is definitely a NATO, supporting state, that if NATO would allow that to happen, a total takeover of Ukraine. It looks like NATO seems to be fine with the region in East Ukraine, falling and that sort of thing, but taking over the whole country directly, that will put Western nations in a peculiar position. Or maybe it brings in some kind of super fast track Ukraine just jumping right into NATO, and then NATO officially goes all in with it, and they just fast track the admission process by Ukraine. That'll be an interesting thing to see as this develops.
And in so doing, guaranteeing that Ukraine will never be used against them, and that Belarus will never become an indefensible salient. From there, Russian provocations into Moldova are almost a certainty next. Another former Soviet state who isn't a member of NATO, and conveniently already has a pro-Russian breakaway state that Russia will eventually get around to recognizing as well. Transnistria. It's all a part of Putin's repeatedly stated goal of bringing back the old Soviet and Russian empire for the 21st century.
Under the banner that these are Russian places. Not just that they are under the Soviet Union, though, but they are Russian. That's what he's trying to use as a far more justified reason, as just, that was part of the Soviet Union and we deserve to do that. Well, yeah, no.
Now that Putin has chosen to invade, it's not entirely clear what's happening as the facts on the ground are rapidly developing. But what is clear are Putin's demands. He has demanded that the West agree to 3 main terms.
Yes.
1, that Ukraine never be allowed to join the NATO alliance. 2, that NATO and the United States withdraw all of their armed forces from Eastern Europe back to the pre-1997 boundaries of NATO, ending in Germany.
That won't happen. There's no way. Poland is such a huge part of NATO troop locations, especially for Americans. I don't think that one. That first part might be, feasible. Ukraine does not join NATO, but like having to push back again. This is why I was saying you need to look at a map of NATO's growth from when it started in 1949 for the next 50 years after that. You'll see that encroachment, which again did not look nearly as threatening to Russia as it does now. Because everything, east of that red line they just drew was not part of it. There was a legit buffer zone that Russia was a lot more pleased with after World War II.
Effectively abandoning Poland, the Baltic states, and much of the rest of Eastern Europe. And that 3, NATO and America agree to freeze the NATO alliance as is and rule out any future expansion of new members. And that the alliance will not hold any military drills in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, or in the Caucasus without prior Russian consent.
But will that go 2 ways? Does that mean, because like in this scenario, although again it's probably seems different, all kinds of Russian drills were right on the border of Ukraine and had been for weeks. So does that go 2 ways, or is that simply supposed to only happen by NATO nations?
The West and NATO, of course, will never accept any of these terms, and Putin must know this. But through the lenses of geographic security, the economics of oil and gas, the changing climate, the shortage of water in Crimea, and Russia's own sensitive internal demographic crisis, it's clear to see what Russia's primary concerns are with Ukraine, and only time will tell how Russia and Vladimir Putin act upon those concerns. But by analyzing how Putin has acted before during times of crisis, we can likely figure out how he'll act again in the future. The recognition of both Donetsk and Luhansk as independent countries and the deployment of Russian troops into both before launching the full-scale invasion across the entire country next mirrors a striking, uncanny resemblance to exactly what Putin and the Russian government did against Georgia 14 years previously, back in 2008.
I remember that,
Then,
yeah,
the
for sure.
Russian army invaded the country of Georgia.
This is when, I remember with the Georgia thing, I remember this was when, this was 2008, 2009, where I was really, I feel like I didn't know much about current Russian foreign policy. And it kind of made sense because these same arguments were happening with Georgia, which was like, you know, a part of the Soviet Empire and was an important part and has all the cultural ties. Shoot, Joseph Stalin was from there, right? Of taking that. I remember having the same exact debate. It was about this idea of basically of self-determination. Do people have the right to become independent and to have that independence? And then at the other side of that, are you required as a nation where you have a legal occupation, right, of a part of your region? Are you obligated to give up your territory if there are like referendums or whatever it is by those people allowing sovereignty, or you know, allowing that kind of sovereignty, right? You might bring that thing up in the American Civil War, right, with the southern states declaring war and the North saying, no, you don't have a legal obligation or a legal justification for that. So no, we're not going to have it. Big difference is Russia and Georgia are these massive powers where Russia could do whatever they want with Georgia pretty much, especially if other nations are going to support them, which pretty much is what happened with Georgia.
In what would ultimately become the first European war of the 21st century. Two pro-Russian breakaway provinces inside of Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, were each recognized by Russia as fully separate and independent countries, and then, by using the pretext of Georgian occupation of both, Russia deployed troops into both, and from there, initiated a full-scale land, sea, and air invasion across the rest of Georgia. Across the 12 days of intense fighting that followed, the Russians occupied both Abkhazia and South Ossetia within Georgia, solidified their de facto independence, and effectively dismembered the country, displacing nearly 200,000 people and causing Georgia to sever all diplomatic relations with Russia. However, it was, in the end, a decisive victory for Russia and for Vladimir Putin, as it kept Georgia from joining NATO, and at a time when NATO and the West were more distracted by the quagmires of Iraq and Afghanistan, there was little international attention, let alone condemnation.
Now that, you know, largely the American involvement now in Afghanistan and Iraq is over, maybe that's become more timely that now American foreign policy, again, which is good at focusing on single things maybe at one time, is putting more effort into Ukraine, although Ukraine is probably seen as more interesting in the way of protecting its autonomy for like the perspective of NATO nations than Georgia, which is not, you know, in NATO. But maybe again, the Russians are seeing that what happened and how it led to Georgia not being a part of NATO is something that they're using as a reason why this type of thing could work in Ukraine, right? There is some kind of precedent there.
It would only be less than 6 years later when Putin would deploy the exact same kinds of tactics that he used against Georgia, against Ukraine, in Crimea, and the Donbass. And now in 2022, it once again appears that history is repeating itself in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Ukraine. Without a doubt, the Russian invasion of Georgia is absolutely critical to understanding how Putin's modern military strategy of dismemberment works, and in understanding what he might ultimately plan to do with Ukraine. But unfortunately, if I made a video about it on YouTube, it's a guarantee that it would get demonetized and age restricted, and as a result, there's simply no way that you would ever see it. So instead, I created yet another full-length companion video video to this one in my ongoing Modern Conflict series that's about the exact same length as this video was, that covers the entire course of the Russian invasion of Georgia from beginning to end, and uploaded it directly to Nebula, which, as you've probably heard by now, is home to tons of exclusive, ad-free content like my entire Modern Conflict series, with 10 other additional full-length episodes with more than 3 hours of additional content that you can go and watch right now, including this 26-minute long video that I made earlier about the entire history and course of the modern conflict between Ukraine and Russia.
Okay, more content for you to check out by checking out their sponsors. Go to the original video link, and then you'll be able to, I think, be directed to their sponsorship, and you can, check out their content, and I would definitely encourage you to support that. All right, let's wrap up this video. All right, so I thought this video was fantastic. It brought in context. Now, it didn't go back as far as maybe I was hoping, in a way, again, to go to back to the Russian Empire and really even the Soviet Union that much, but it did a brilliant job of more local and recent context. And any historical context is important, right? And the more recent the context, the more important. But I think it made up for that. Made up for not having the older, we're talking like more decades and centuries before. I think it made up for not having that by doing way more context that is more based on more present years. And there was a bunch of things I had learned about that was new here, with some of the new gas reserve discoveries around the Ukraine, and that brought another element of this conflict that I didn't know. So like, hey, me as an educator, I'm still learning about context, and I feel like I was able to, and I've been able to give a lot, but man, there's just more and more and more. And it's the biggest reason why we need to study history. I tell my students this: studying history helps us know how the world works, and it explains how the world is the way it is. And we're living in that. We're living in the effects of history, and we're going to be making decisions as a society, which is a human society, about about our actions and how we treat each other. And these things can lead to awful things like it's happening right now with this war breaking out. And understanding that historical context will allow us to make better informed decisions to make improvements. Because one thing I liked about this video is at the very beginning of this whole video, I was saying how there's good content and there's bad content out of there. There's content that's just not useful, right? Like if it's just a video that all it does is say Russia bad, Russia bad, Russia bad, like that doesn't get you anywhere as far as an understanding of it. You have to look at it from reasons. Okay, yeah, you might still and still be saying, okay, why is this happening? Because Putin bad, Russia bad. But you have to be able to explain why. Why? You don't have to necessarily change your point on it, right? At all, but it gives you an informed opinion. And we don't do that enough. We don't have informed opinions. And oftentimes I feel like we view that just by having an opinion, it makes it valid. But no, information is what makes opinions valid, not just some inherent ability that because we can have them, they're justified. And there we go. That's my my preaching about the importance of history there. Now, again, I learned a ton from this. I think this is the best video I've seen thus far on recent context of the war. I'm glad this was recommended to me. I had heard that this was really good at it, again, because it gives so much detail and then just sticks to data and actions and history. And then you're able to create conclusions on your own. All right. Again, this original video link is down below. Make sure you do that. Make sure you give them a thumbs up, subscribe. If you waited this long or you went this long through this video, thank you so much for being here. Enable notifications so you can see my new videos. Subscribe. Even if you want to see more videos about local or current conflicts. Again, my thing will always be about giving historical context rather than current evaluations and judgments. It'll be about the history of it. And that's something you want me to consider to keep doing, let me know. Okay, I'll know by the view count, but I'll also know by your feedback in the comments section and that sort of thing. So sub if you liked it. You'll see more content like this. There's links to other stuff that I have down below, gaming channel, Discord server, and links to a whole bunch of different ways, social media to interact as well. All right, and with that, we'll see you next time. Bye.